والصلاة والسلام على سيد الخلق أجمعين أبو القاسم محمد.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
The religion of Islam is a world religion, so its presence can be felt all over the world and in everyday life and in what we see in society. What we can see then about Islam most commonly and most visibly is Islam's presence in the West being the hijab, which is generally referred to as the headdress used by Muslim women to cover their heads, or to cover their hair. Being the most obvious symbol of Islam's presence, is also the easiest target for harassment against Muslim people. Whenever you hear a racist politician or whenever you hear the media attack Muslims, the very first target in which they look for is the hijab of our Muslim women. We even have so-called experts on Islam, on the Middle East. They take a patronizing attitude towards the hijab. They try and teach Muslims that the hijab is not a religious requirement and that it is something which is merely a cultural issue invented by men in order to oppress women. So, inshallah, tonight I'll do one lecture on the physical hijab and its Islamic sense, and then next week, inshallah, we'll talk about the hijab of the eyes and the social hijab as well. The hijab is a sensitive issue in today's world, especially. Even amongst Muslims themselves, there are disagreements, there are arguments about the concept of the hijab, the meaning of it, and how to apply it and how to wear it. So this talk, this lecture, will contain none of my own personal opinions. Instead, it will solely be from the sources in which we derive all Islamic knowledge from, which is the Holy Quran, the Ahadith narrations, and the words of our scholars and ulama. So what does the Quran say about the hijab? Well, Islam as a religion has strongly emphasized the concept of decency and of modesty between the interaction of different sexes and different genders. Dress code and the way in which Muslim people dress is part of that overall teaching which Islam has come with a complete ruling and a complete message on. There are two specific verses that I want to talk about today from the Quran in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about the issue of decency and of hijab in the way in which we defined it earlier. So firstly, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Holy Quran, say to the believing men that they should cast down their glances and guard their private parts by being chaste, and this is better for them. The verse after that then addresses women, and it says, say to the believing women that they should cast down their glances and guard their private parts by being chaste. Do you notice how in the Holy Quran Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about the hijab of men before he talks about the hijab of women? He addresses men before he addresses women when talking about this concept. It's interesting because we always seem to make the concept and discussion of hijab about women when we forget that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions it to men in the first place before he talks about the hijab of women. And sometimes we even forget the entirety of Islamic hijab for men and for males. However, this is just as important in its own unique way and aspect. However, next week I'll talk about this a little bit more. So as you can see from those two verses, it talks about the hijab of the eyes. And after this, another verse of the Holy Quran was revealed regarding the dress code, the physical dress, specifically for women. And the verse says, and let them not display their beauty except what is apparent, and they should place their khumr over their body. So what does that word khumr mean? It's the plural of the word khimar, which in Arabic means a veil which covers the head. So the most famous Arabic dictionary that you can find in the Middle East, in the Arabic world, amongst scholars, amongst academics, is al-Munjid. And it defines that very word as something with which a woman conceals her head and her hair with. So this is the literal meaning, and this is the exact word in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses when he talks about the hijab for women. Another verse of the Holy Quran then says, it gives a dress code instruction to women. It says, O Prophet, say to your wives and your daughters and the women of the believers that they should let down upon themselves their jalab. Alaykum salam. So what is jalab? It's the plural of jilbab. which means a loose outer garment. And this means then, from these two verses, when we look at them, when we observe the Arabic language and the grammar which is used, it means that the Islamic dress code for women specifically does not just consist of a veil or covering over the hair, it also includes the overall dress, which should be long and should be loose. This is what the Holy Quran says. What did Ahlul Bayt say? You have Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq alayhi salam. He was asked about, for example, the forearms of a woman and whether that is included in her beauty, what's classed as beauty or adornment. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, and they should not display their beauty except for their husbands. Someone asked the Imam, does this include the forearms of women? And the Imam said yes. And what is beneath the veil covering her head is from the beauty, and also what is beneath or below the wrists, so anything below the wrists. As you can see then from what Imam Sadiq alayhi salam says, in this authentic narration which he reports, he has exempted what? The face and the hands from being what is classed as the beauty. Everything else apart from that has been counted as what the Holy Quran says, the beauty that should not be displayed except for their husbands. So we keep talking about women and we keep talking about hijab when it comes to women. Before we even discuss the concept of wearing it, we need to understand the reasons why women are instructed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to wear it. And what's the philosophy behind it? Did he make it so that they would just be in a state of hardship? No. As Muslims, by definition, first of all, we are the ones who submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala entirely. We carry out His orders without question. And of course, we find that the reasons for certain matters, we find out the reasons for things. We don't follow blindly, but at the same time, we submit entirely to the commandments of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, with no compromise on this. If Allah says something, then it has to be done. This is the first way of observing it, but we can go and take a more theological approach to it. Allah says in the Holy Quran, O Prophet, ask your wives, daughters, and the believing women to draw their clothes over their bodies. In this way, it is more likely that they will be recognized as virtuous and not be harassed. And Allah is all forgiving and most merciful. So from this verse of the Quran, there's 3 points to mention. Men, whether or not they admit it or they confess it themselves, they are slaves of their own lust and desire. Men, a lot of the time, they don't think with reason, they don't think religiously, if you want to put it that way. They think with their desires and their lust and their passion. So with bearing this in mind, these 3 points I want to mention are, firstly, the hijab protects women from such men and from the actions of men in this way. It symbolizes that a woman has been sanctified to one man only, and she is off limit to any other man. The Quran, in this sense, it doesn't blame women. It doesn't say that it is the fault of women that they need to wear the hijab, rather it's the opposite. It says that men, because they are the slaves of their own desires, require for the women to wear the hijab. And this is a safeguard for women, this is an area of protection for women because of the fault of men. Secondly, the hijab contributes to the stability and to the preservation of marriage, of family, of society. How? By eliminating the chances of, for example, extramarital affairs. And lastly, it compels and it forces men to focus on the real personality of a woman, and it takes away the emphasis of her physical and outward beauty. It puts the woman in control of strangers' reactions to her. When a stranger then sees a woman, his first thought when she's wearing the hijab is not on her physical appearance or her beauty. And that is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has ordered women to cover what is deemed as their beauty, so that when people get to know a Muslim woman, they see her for more than just an object of beauty to look at. So we spoke about the hijab for women. Now it's time to speak about the hijab for men. So from the ahadith of the Prophet and from the Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam regarding the type of covering that men must observe, such as the forbidden nature of imitating the kuffar, the non-Muslims, and various other different conditions, we can draw the conclusion that just like women, men must not wear clothing which is inappropriate, which is tight-fitting, for example, and one which shows off his body and the frame of his body. What's important to mention also is that when we use the term hijab in relation to men, it doesn't have the same technical meaning as it does in reference to women. Why? Because the human nature of a man and a woman are quite different, and everyone knows this, and thus too their hijab is also deemed as slightly different. And what you need to remember is that the word hijab simply means covering, and thus men too must cover their bodies from the view of non-mahram women. Now, although it's not wajib for a man to completely cover his entire body as it is for a woman, with the exception of the face and hands, it's also haram for the woman to look at the body of the non-mahram man. And thus, in order for women not to fall into sin, it has been recommended by our ulama, by our scholars, that men should cover their entire body and they should refrain from wearing short sleeve shirts and clothing which shows off the curves and the figure of their body. And this, by the way, is not my opinion. This is the opinion of multiple different scholars such as Sayyid Sistani and Khomeini, etc. Big scholars have all deemed this to be the case. Ayatollah Bahjat, who I spoke about a few weeks ago, also had a ruling which he states that according to obligatory precaution, which is ihtiyat wajib, a man must cover his body from non-mahram women even if it doesn't lead to haram act or sin. So that is the physical hijab for men and women very briefly. But because I mentioned at the start that hijab is a controversial topic in today's world, especially in today's society, the most common question which gets asked is the hijab an act of oppression on women? So you have different people, you have feminists, you have Western media, they come and they portray the hijab as a symbol of oppression. They see it as a sign of slavery for women in Islam. But if you look at it from an objective point of view, this is a very sexist angle of viewing the hijab. And what does it do? It reflects the influence of Western feminists who subconsciously react to the Jewish and the Christian concept of their veil, their hijab. And what is that? In the Jewish and Christian religions, when it talks about hijab, it means the symbol of a woman's subjection to her husband. Of course, this is not what the Islamic hijab is. And when, for example, if we're talking about oppression, when you have the Europeans, when they unjustly went to Africa, for example, over 100, 200 years ago, they found some of the tribes in Africa walking about naked with no clothes on. So what did they do? They forced those tribes to wear clothes, because in their mind, the people who wear clothes are the civilized ones, and the ones who walk about with no clothes are the uncivilized ones. Now, those very same European invaders who forced people to wear clothes are now in France, Belgium, trying to get people to take off their clothes, take off the hijab. They banned the hijab in schools, in public buildings. Those advocates of civilization, if they want to call themselves civilized people, are now taking off, ripping off their own clothes and saying that this is the sign of civilization. And it makes you wonder if those tribes in Africa who originally were naked, if those primitive tribes from centuries ago, what makes them less civilized than the Europeans now? At least those ones in Africa had the firmness to stick to one belief rather than constantly changing. After all, it is now the rest of the world which is imitating the ways of that so-called primitive society. But that doesn't answer the question. Is the hijab an act of oppression on women? No. Hijab is not a symbol or an act of oppression. Women, as we unfortunately know, are oppressed everywhere in the world, in every single society, because of various different reasons, even in countries where women have never even heard about the concept of hijab. On the contrary, what I would argue, and what Islam argues, is that the practice of, for example, displaying pictures of nearly naked women on billboards, on TVs, all over social media, in the entertainment industry, in the cinemas in the West, is that not a symbol of oppression? Are you not turning a woman into something that's just an object to be looked at? Neither does the hijab, for example, prevent a woman from acquiring knowledge or from contributing to the betterment of society. Historically, if you look back into Islamic history, you'll see that women are one of the greatest contributors to Islam, not just men. You have Lady Khadija, for example, the first wife of the Holy Prophet, she played a significant role in the early history of Islam. She was a successful businesswoman. She was the first person to accept the message of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We have, for example, women today, especially in Iran, who become scholars higher than most men will ever achieve. You go into the Hawza, there are some women who are so far above the men that the women have become mujtahids, and that men emulate them and look up to them for their religious advice. If you then argue that the hijab is an act of oppression on women, you're basically saying one thing. And this applies to Muslims who argue against the concept of hijab. If you say that the veil which a woman must wear in Islam is an act of oppression, then what you're saying is that both Lady Khadija and Sayyidah Fatima al-Zahra were both oppressed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What you're saying is that they were oppressed by Rasulullah. What you're saying is that they were oppressed by Amir al-Mu'mineen. They ordered the following of Islamic law when they encouraged the practice of wearing the hijab. If you say that the hijab is an act of oppression, then what you're saying is Allah has unjustly oppressed Lady Khadija and Sayyidah Fatima. And no one from the Muslims is going to admit something like that. No one in their hearts who is a Muslim is going to accept such a silly message as that. And if you look back again to history, you'll see that one of the most important events in early Islamic history was the event in Karbala. And as you know, Yazid massacred Imam Hussein alayhi salam, massacred his family, massacred his companions. But it was Imam Hussein's sister, Sayyidah Zainab, who continued on that social protest, who continued on that revolution, who was the most influential person in bringing about the awakening amongst the society, amongst people at the time, to stand up against the tyranny of Yazid and his government, and against tyrants everywhere. Sayyidah Zainab, the woman who greatly contributed to the factors which eventually brought the downfall of the Umayyads. It wasn't a man who continued on that revolution, it was a woman. So to conclude, I know today I focused mainly on the hijab of women, and it might seem that I heavily advised them and I focused on their hijab the most. But next week we'll have our chance to inform the Muslim men and brothers here of the very strict and numerous duties which they have in regards to their own hijab. But it's important that for any sisters who listen to someone lecturing about hijab, that we let them know as Muslim men that we're very proud of them. That we are in awe of what they have to go through. For us, when we go out into the street, it's no big deal. We don't walk about every day wearing dishtasha. We don't wear a scarf every day. We wear normal jeans, t-shirt. They have to wear abaya, they have to wear hijab everywhere they go. And it's very difficult for them. In fact, I don't think most Muslim men would even be able to do what the women do in regards to carrying out the obligation of wearing hijab. So their achievement is great and we should applaud them for it. And if there's a fault in the hijab of women, you don't go and attack and insult them. You advise them privately through whatever halal means you have in order to encourage this practice. Why? Because it's for the betterment of them and it's one of the commandments of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And just to quickly finish, the famous scholar Amina as-Sadr, or otherwise known as Bint al-Huda, the sister of the martyred Sayyid al-Shaheed Muhammad Baqir as-Sadr, she gave some advice for women wearing the hijab and who may have doubts about the hijab. So I'm not going to give my advice as a man, I'll give the advice of Bint al-Huda. What she said was, the idea of hijab, which you may think of as backwards, is indeed the most brilliant social deed in which a woman becomes the most dear woman known to history. The concept of non-hijab, or the concept of not wearing a hijab, is indeed what represents backwardness, as it brings women back to the state of Jahiliyyah before the time of Islam. So I know it's a very short and brief discussion about the physical aspects of hijab, and next week, inshallah, I'll mention the hijab of the eyes and the social hijab. But inshallah, this gives a little bit more insight into the duties and the obligations of men and of women in regards to the importance and the rules when it comes to hijab. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Allah.